that you will probably recognize. You've seen him a lot on television, and I guess maybe we're gonna show the piece of one of them right now. Roll the tape. He does a lot of commercial work.
For 3 decades, Johnny Carson reigned supreme as the king of late-night television. With his quick wit, charming smile, and unmatched timing, he welcomed millions of Americans into their living rooms every evening. To viewers, Carson was more than a host. He was a trusted companion, a familiar presence who made the troubles of the day disappear with a perfectly delivered monologue or a sly raised eyebrow. But behind the immaculate smile and polished delivery, there were nights that Carson quietly loathed. Nights where the guests, the chaos, or even fate itself pushed him to the edge of his patience. His job was to make it all look effortless. Yet, there were moments when that facade nearly cracked. And when it did, those who worked closest to him saw a very different side of the unflappable king. Hosting a live show for 30 years with thousands of celebrity guests, unpredictable animals, and unpredictable circumstances meant uncomfortable moments were inevitable. But some encounters cut deeper. Some pushed Carson to levels of irritation, embarrassment, or even anger that he never forgot. These moments, rarely discussed in their full context, reveal more about Johnny Carson than his perfect monologues ever could. They peel back the layers of a man who valued control above all else, and hated when that control was taken away. One of the earliest signs of this came from the man who should have been his easiest guest, Bob Hope. Hope was a comedy legend, and no one appeared on Carson's Tonight Show more than him. He was NBC's golden boy, a guaranteed ratings magnet. And yet, Carson dreaded every single one of his appearances. By the late 1970s and 80s, Hope's visits had become painfully predictable. He would walk on, recite pre-written jokes regardless of Carson's questions, play a clip from his latest NBC special, and leave. It was mechanical. Carson, a master of improvisation, despised this robotic routine. To him, good television came from spontaneity, the genuine spark between host and guest. Hope's appearances felt lifeless, rehearsed, and above all, self-serving. According to producer Peter Lasley, when Carson was told Hope wanted to come on again, Johnny would sigh and mutter, "Again?" He knew he couldn't refuse NBC's biggest star, but he resented the obligation. As Hope aged, his failing eyesight and hearing made things worse. He would often miss cues or respond to the wrong question entirely, leaving Carson to pick up the pieces. After one particularly excruciating appearance, Carson was heard backstage saying, "If I ever end up like that, somebody just shoot me." If Bob Hope was a slow burn of irritation, Chevy Chase was a spark that lit an instant fire. In 1986, Chase came on to promote Three Amigos. From the moment he sat down, his ego filled the room. He spoke over Carson, hijacked the conversation, and directed his answers to the audience instead of the host. To Carson, that was the ultimate late-night sin, ignoring the man behind the desk. The tension was obvious to anyone paying attention. Carson's jaw tightened, his pencil tapped harder against the desk, and his smile turned stiff. When the segment ended, Carson was still gracious on camera, but off-air, he was done. "I don't need that kind of trouble in my life," he told his producer. "Let him go on one of the other shows." But not every uncomfortable moment came from celebrities. Sometimes, Carson himself lit the match. Take Myrtle Young, the elderly woman famous for her potato chip collection shaped like faces and animals. She came on in 1987, proudly showing her chips to Carson and the audience. It was wholesome television until Johnny decided to prank her. While her back was turned, he picked up an ordinary potato chip, bit into it loudly, and pretended he'd eaten one of her prized pieces. The horror on Myrtle's face was instant and real. She nearly collapsed from the shock. The audience roared with laughter, but Carson's own face betrayed something else: regret. He immediately reassured her it was just a regular chip, but the damage was done. Later, Carson admitted it was a cruel joke he wished he could take back. Years afterward, he would reference that moment as one of his deepest regrets. Proof that even the master of comedy sometimes miscalculated. Then there was Milton Berle. In 1965, Uncle Milty showed up and essentially hijacked the show. Berle interrupted Carson's questions, launched into long-winded stories, even directed the band and cameras as if he were the host. Carson, who prided himself on controlling every beat of his program, seethed inside. He held his composure on air, but backstage he exploded. Never book him again without making sure he respects the format. That night fueled Carson's later policy of gatekeeping, which comedians were allowed to sit on the couch. A rule born directly from his hatred of losing control. Then there was Milton Berle. In 1965, Uncle Milty showed up and essentially hijacked the show. Berle interrupted Carson's questions, launched into long-winded stories, even directed the band and cameras as if he were the host. Carson, who prided himself on controlling every beat of his program, seethed inside. He held his composure on air, but backstage he exploded. Never book him again without making sure he respects the format. That night fueled Carson's later policy of gatekeeping, which comedians were allowed to sit on the couch. A rule born directly from his hatred of losing control. But perhaps the most infamous of Carson's early clashes came in June 1987, when Madonna made her first-ever talk show appearance. She arrived in black lingerie worn as outerwear, and from the moment she sat down, she turned the interview into a game of sexual innuendo. Every question Carson asked was flipped back with suggestive, often blunt answers. At one point, she told him, "I thought you should be my first." The audience roared, but Carson's discomfort was clear. To him, this wasn't conversation. It was performance. And worse, it dragged him into territory he didn't want on his show. Behind the scenes, he admitted his frustration. It was a clash of cultures, a clash of generations. Madonna represented a new wave of celebrity that thrived on provocation. Carson represented old-school broadcasting, where guests talked, joked, and revealed something real. That night left him privately fuming, caught between looking prudish or endorsing something that wasn't his style. And if provocative pop stars tested his patience, nothing tested it more than animals. In one of his earliest disasters, in 1969, a tiny marmoset was placed on his shoulder. Within seconds, it urinated all over Carson's hair and suit. The audience howled, but Carson was horrified. He joked through the segment, but backstage he stormed into the showers and demanded his hair be restyled before returning to set. Losing control like that, especially in such a humiliating way, gnawed at him. Years later, in 1975, a supposedly tame black panther lunged at Carson from its cage, swiping so close he fell backward onto the studio floor. The footage became blooper reel gold, replayed endlessly, much to Carson's embarrassment. For him, the problem wasn't the scare itself. It was becoming the butt of the joke on his own show, a position he despised. By 1977, things got even messier when a baby elephant, frightened by the studio lights, defecated on stage in a flood that seemed endless. The smell filled the studio, the audience roared, and Carson's disgust was visible as his desk had to be moved mid-show. It dragged on far longer than he could tolerate, and afterward, New rules were put in place for animal appearances. And then, of course, there was the camel. In 1986, Carson was coaxed into feeding it a carrot. The camel snapped, biting his fingers along with the carrot. Carson, clearly in pain, forced a smile but couldn't hide his anger. Afterward, he banned himself from feeding animals on air ever again. From then on, handlers handled the food, not Johnny. Through all these moments, from egotistical celebrities to chaotic animals, Carson's true self occasionally peeked out. He was a man who demanded control, who valued professionalism, and who hated being made a fool of. Yet he also had the grace to push through, to keep the show alive, even when inside he was silently fuming. Johnny Carson loved variety, and nothing brought variety quite like the animal segments that became a staple of The Tonight Show. For audiences, these moments were unpredictable, hilarious, and often unforgettable. But for Carson, they were also some of his most dreaded encounters, because when you invite live animals onto a brightly lit television stage, chaos is never far behind. One of the earliest mishaps came in 1969, when animal handler Joan Embery introduced a tiny marmoset. At first, the primate seemed harmless, until it climbed right onto Johnny's perfectly styled hair and relieved itself. The audience erupted, but Carson, feeling warm liquid running down his neck, wasn't laughing. He joked in the moment, "I've had people pee on my parade before, but never on my head." But backstage, he was furious. That carefully groomed image was everything to him, and in one instant, it was shattered. From that day on, handlers were given strict rules, no surprises. But rules didn't stop disasters. In 1975, a black panther lunged at Carson from inside its cage, swiping within inches of his face. Johnny jumped so high, he actually fell backward to the studio floor. The audience roared. Blooper reels replayed the fall endlessly, and Carson hated every second of it. He'd worked his whole career to maintain composure, and suddenly he was the joke.